Good afternoon, and welcome to DCTA's Financial Management Series on Timekeeping and Personnel Activity Reporting. My name is Michelle Minter, and I'm a Senior Financial Management Consultant with Corporate Facts, and I'll be your facilitator for this training. Let's begin. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some of the topics that we'll be covering today. Today, we'll be talking about timekeeping and reporting. We'll look specifically at the requirements of timekeeping and reporting. We'll also take a look at the details and data captured in your timekeeping system. Now, in this section, we'll look at the different options available for capturing data. And then we'll take a look at personnel activity reporting. We'll look at a couple of examples of a personnel activity report, as well as talk a little bit about program administrative costs and activity delivery costs, as well as review a sample timekeeping policy. Next slide, please. Now, this training will help guide you in implementing a system which accurately captures all work performed. And per 2 CFR, Part 200.430, it tells us that all documentation for compensation of personal services must be based upon records which accurately reflect work performed in order to be submitted to a federal grant. 2 CFR Part 200.430 also tells us that compensation for personal services include all payments for services rendered during the period of performance. Let's take a look at what compensation for personal services might include. It can include wages and salaries and fringe benefits. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some common examples of fringe benefits. A couple examples might be paid time off, which might include vacation, holiday, sick or bereavement time. It might include health insurance, retirement plans, and workers' compensation insurance. Next slide, please. Now, in order to charge compensation for staff working on federal awards, the compensation must meet 3 criteria. It must be reasonable, allocable, and allowable. Let's talk a little bit about each of those criteria. A cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount, it does not exceed what would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances. So in other words, it is considered reasonable if the cost is similar to what you pay on the open market. A cost is allocable to a particular federal award or other cost objective if the goods or services involved are chargeable or assignable to that federal award or cost objective in accordance with the relative benefits received. Now, to help determine if a cost is allocable, ask this question: does it benefit the award or cost objective? If it does, then that cost is allocable to that federal award. Next slide, please. To be allowable, a cost must meet additional criteria. A few of those criteria are that cost is necessary and reasonable. It must be per the agreement. It must conform to any limitation or exclusions in that federal award. It must be consistent with policies and procedures that are uniformly applied to all awards of that non-federal entity. It has to meet the requirements of generally accepted accounting principles. It cannot be treated as cost for sharing or matching on any other federally financed program. And the cost must be incurred during the approved budget period. And the cost must be documented. It must have adequate detailed support which proves the validity of the expenditure. An example of adequate documentation to support compensation would be a personnel activity report, or for fringe benefits, a detailed paid invoice. Next slide, please. Adequate documentation for personnel expenses charged to a federal award must accurately reflect all work performed by the employee across all activities. The document must be supported by internal controls. It must be included in the official record of the organization. And the documentation must be signed by the employee and approved by his or her supervisor. Next slide, please. Now on this slide, we'll look at the information that's captured on a timesheet and the information captured on a personnel activity report. The timesheet records the amount of time an employee spends on a single activity. A personnel activity report captures 100% of the hours worked by an employee. It also captures the hours worked by cost objective. Some examples of a cost objective could be a program, an award, or even a department. The personnel activity report will serve as your basis for allocating salaries and wages across multiple activities. Now, both the timesheet and the personnel activity report captures work performed during a specific period, and both must be signed by the employee and approved by his supervisor. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the information that should be captured by your timekeeping system. Your timekeeping system should capture the actual hours charged to each activity or cost objective. It should identify hours worked by labor category and federal award. Your system should ensure that the nature of the work being performed is being determined by actual hours spent working on a cost objective, and not just because there's funding available for that cost objective. It should also ensure that the timesheets are accurate and complete. Now, this can be accomplished by having a supervisor review and approve the timesheets, and by having an established policy and procedure in place. I'll show you an example of a personnel activity report policy further in the presentation. Next slide, please. Let's look at the options for timekeeping. There are two types of timekeeping options available. Let's look at the first one, which is a contemporaneous method. With a contemporaneous method, the employees enter their time daily, and that time can be entered through a manual log system or electronically through software. Then there's a reconstructive timekeeping method. With this method, the employee relies on notes, calendars, emails, call logs, and phone records, or other documentation to assist in the reconstruction of actual time spent within each completed grant activity. Do not use the two methods simultaneously. And between the two, the contemporaneous method is the preferred method. Next slide, please. On this slide, we'll look at a timesheet. We'll also talk about how this simple timesheet can be transformed into a personnel activity report. A timesheet is a method which records the amount of workers' time spent on an activity. It reports basic information like a start and end time, breaks taken by the employee, as well as any overtime hours. Now, this timesheet can be transformed into a personnel activity report simply by adding a cost objective. Once a cost objective is added, The timesheet now details the hours spent on a specific funding source, program, or even administrative duties. Next slide, please. In these next couple of slides, we'll see examples of personnel activity reports where you have one employee charging his or her time to a single activity. We'll also see an example of an employee charging his time to two activities. And then we'll also look at a report of an employee whose hours are being allocated among different grants and administrative based on the actual time worked by that employee. We'll also take a look at what a standard policy for personnel activity reporting looks like. Now, as we review these examples of personnel activity reports, note how each document meets the requirements. They will account for all activities worked by that employee. It'll be certified by the employee and the supervisor. It'll reflect actual activity of each employee's hours and that cost objective. Also note that each personal activity report tracks the hours spent, cost objective, which is your funding source or program, project award, the time period for which the personal activity report is representing. It'll track 100% of the employee's time to be compensated, as well as identify any activity delivery costs or any program activity costs. Next slide, please. Before we get to those exhibits, let's talk a little bit about program administrative costs or activity delivery costs. When completing the personnel activity report, you should not only account for your actual hours spent on an activity, but that time should also be allocated between program administration and activity delivery. Now, program administrative costs, they're often frequently confused and incorrectly reported. Program administrative costs are costs that the grantee or the subrecipient may incur to administer the program as a whole. Some of those examples might be program planning, monitoring, financial management, and reporting. The cost charged to administrative activities may be capped at a specific ceiling depending upon the grant regulations. For example, your CDBG has a 20% ceiling for administrative costs. Now note that it's the grantee that determines what portion of admin is shared with each subrecipient. And the amount and use of the administration funds must be outlined in your grant agreement. Your activity delivery costs are costs incurred to carry out specific activities. Examples of that might be environmental review, administering your Davis-Bacon requirements, and project management. Your activity delivery costs are not subject to an administrative cap. Next slide, please. Okay, in this first exhibit, we'll see an employee charging actual time incurred to a single award, and also some sick leave. This personnel activity report reflects 100% of the employee's time for a specific time period, and it reflects how that time was allocated. Note that there's a place for the employee to sign as well as his or her supervisor. Next slide, please. In this exhibit, we see an employee allocating time to a couple different grants. It reflects 100% of the hours worked and how that time was allocated across funding sources for a specific time period. It also reflects sick and vacation time taken by that employee during that time frame. Next slide, please. And in this final exhibit, we see how that employee is allocating actual hours spent on several activities. This employee has also identified the actual time spent on program administration and activity delivery. Next slide, please. In this section, we'll take a look at documentation required for reimbursement. For reimbursement of salary and wages charged to a federal award, specific documentation is typically required. The required documentation for reimbursement of salary and wages are a personnel activity report, which reflects 100% of the actual hours spent on all activities for that pay period, and payroll records showing wages paid during that covered period. Next slide, please. And for the reimbursement of fringe benefits, the required documents are payroll reports showing employer paid taxes and invoices showing payment of other benefits such as insurance and retirement plans. To support the compensated leave, the organization should submit its compensated leave policy. Next slide, please. Your organization should have a personnel activity report policy. Here we'll look at what a personnel activity report policy should contain. It should contain a scope, and that scope communicates who the policy applies to. It should have a policy statement. The statement communicates the purpose of the policy. It should also state the reason for the policy. And it should detail the procedures. Now, the procedures communicate the steps that are necessary to be in compliance with that policy. In this next slide, we'll look at an example of a personnel activity report policy. This sample policy can be used as a guide to create your own policy. Next slide, please. And here we have an example of a personnel activity report. And as you can see, there's a scope. We have our policy statement and the reason for this policy. And then in the next section, we detail the procedures that are needed to follow in order to be in compliance with your policy. Next slide, please. Next, we have some frequently asked questions. Let's take a look at some of those. If an employee is documenting personnel activity and is not sure what grant or fund code to charge, what should they do? And the answer would be that the personnel activity report can be prepared using a description of the jobs performed. And this description should then match the tasks associated with the grant or fund code that you're charging. Question 2 is, does personnel activity reporting only need to show hours worked under a specific federal grants program? And the answer to that is no. Your personnel activity reporting must reflect 100% of the individual's time. It should not be based on a 40-hour work week, but include all hours worked by that individual for that specific time period. Can administrative and/or management's personnel costs be charged as a cost of the grant? And that answer is yes. Administrative costs can be charged as cost of federal grants. And that concludes our presentation for today.